Well, welcome back, everyone, to the USA at 250 Years course. Thanks for coming out on such a cold morning. But we still have Richard MacMaster with us at home, and he'll be presenting a presentation today that's entitled, How Democratic Was It? How Democratic Was the Revolution? How democratic was the United States after the revolution? And also, how did the U.S. end up paying its war debt? That's particularly important.
In the first of this series, we looked at the many different threads that fed into the causes of the American Revolution and some of the emphases that different scholars had seen of one or another of those possible causes. So, for example, going back to last week, if we want to emphasize the quest for power in the lower houses of the assembly through the late colonial period, then as Jack Green proposed back in the 60s as a very major issue, that they had gained complete control within their own colony, and consequently, when it came to writing the Articles of Confederation, the people, or the leadership, shall we say, the political leadership of Virginia or South Carolina or Massachusetts were not enamored with the idea of handing power over to an executive or to a strong central government. Now, in 1926, when Franklin Jameson published the American Revolution considered as a social movement, he put great emphasis, as indeed was to be found in a lot of the documents of 1776, that removing barriers to voting was the safest way to preserve liberty. So let's look at let's go down one now, please. The vision of 1776, was it for both a complete democracy with everyone able to cast a vote, and also, as we'll see, for an economic equality? Was there a pressure to say, let's have a taxation system that will not favor one class over another, and that land will be truly available to everyone? So let's look at the vision of 1776 now, for next one. Well, one more, thanks. All right. In November 1776, Pennsylvania adopted a constitution. As far as voting was concerned, there were no property qualifications whatsoever to vote or to hold elective office. That also, they abolished any religious or racial barrier. One did not have to be a Christian or a Protestant. One did not have to be white. Anyone living within the boundaries of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania could not only vote, but could also be elected to the assembly and make laws for the benefit of everyone. And they looked to a fair taxation system because Pennsylvania had a long struggle with the Penn family who wanted their property, if it happened to be the most valuable lot in downtown Philadelphia, assessed at the same rate as the most worthless acre on the side of a mountain in western Pennsylvania. So they were very aware of this. Now, here is an absolute democracy in 1776. And let's go to the next one. We want to go to Maryland now, please. All right. Now, Maryland had already adopted a constitution in August 1776. They were very quick to do this. They had a property qualification on the ability to vote. You had to own property worth at least 50 pounds in Maryland currency, which was substantial. So if you were a freehold farmer, you owned your land, you would probably automatically qualify to vote. However, you had to profess the Christian religion in addition to that. And many people in Maryland who did not own real estate or other tangible property that met that standard were unable to vote, unlike Pennsylvania where everybody votes. But it's interesting here that beyond that, Maryland wanted to make sure that the state was governed by an elite. To be elected to the House of Delegates, you needed property worth 500 pounds. To be elected to the Senate, the upper house, or as a delegate to the Continental Congress, you had to be worth 1,000 pounds. And to be elected governor, you needed to have property worth 5,000 pounds. They were obviously interested, as we might say, in a quality vote rather than a quantity vote. They wanted to tame the number of people who would be voting, and certainly they would only be people who we might call stakeholders rather than simply people who lived within the bounds of Maryland. And let's go on to the next one, but here we go to the next one. Well, we'll just hold this here for a moment. When Jefferson wrote the Northwest Ordinance, he was looking to what he would later term a free yeomanry, that there would be no slaves in the new states that would be carved out of the states above the territory above the Ohio River. And land would be sold in basically farm units to individuals rather than to large companies of land speculators, although the land speculators who had done a good job of carving up at least the state of Ohio would be entitled to keep their blocks of land. Now, Pennsylvania, in its constitution, was looking to something like that, that everyone would be on more or less the same level. It would not be a government of wealthy, in the case of Pennsylvania, merchants in Philadelphia. It would be one in which the smallest farmer, and indeed the day laborer in the city, would have equal say in determining matters like taxation and determining matters like the issuing of money. Let's go to the next one. All right, now, there has been, from what was the very first settlement, a chronic shortage of cash in all the colonies. And by cash, we mean specie, hard money. Sometimes they called it red money, gold, silver, coins of any European country. Very, very difficult to come by. So all of the colonies, or nearly all of them, had, through the 18th century, found ways to issue paper currency so that you had a system in which the colony of South Carolina, the colony of Pennsylvania, would print money. And it said that it was to be used for all transactions. And it was really a load against future taxes, so that it had every piece of paper that said it was £1 Maryland currency had a date at which it would no longer be valid, because by that time the taxation would have covered this kind of advanced loan. And a number of colonies, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania particularly, had land banks in which it was really basically a kind of a mortgage operation run by the colony, that if I needed money to be able to bring in a more profitable crop next year than the one that had either failed or at an incredibly low price this year, I could mortgage my farm and draw as much cash as I needed. So this was something that was not liked very much by either the people in British Parliament and the colonial office, but equally not liked by merchants in both the colonies and in Britain. because the paper currency, as it got closer and closer to its date, would depreciate in value. So if I paid my bill at the country store with paper money worth 35 pounds, by the time the merchant in Philadelphia got it, it might very well have depreciated to 5 pounds. So they were very hostile to both of these. Let's go on to the next one. I'm a little slow this morning. All right. Now, during the Revolution, the states, the independent states, and the Continental Congress had issued paper money freely. That meant that, as everybody knows, you gradually reached the point where it was a commonplace saying that it's not worth a continental, that the continental bills, particularly because they had no power to tax, had deteriorated or depreciated rather to such an extent that it didn't matter what the bill said on its face. It was basically just a piece of paper. And during the war, for obvious reasons, the military had to requisition all kinds of goods. They had to requisition food, flour, bacon, livestock, cattle, simply to keep the army in the field. And what they did was they gave Farmer Briggerhoff a piece of paper that said that you have given me 2 fat steers for the Pennsylvania Continental Regiment, and Pennsylvania or the Continental Congress will repay you at the rate of 25 pounds for each. That's a fair price. So you have a piece of paper that says that I am owed 50 pounds. At the same time, all through the war, because especially the Continental Congress had no money, but the states very quickly ran out of any kind of money. The wages for men who served with the Continental Army or with the state militia were simply written off. And once again, you had a piece of paper that said, for taking part in this campaign in Western New York in 1778, you were entitled to so much money, but nobody gave you that money. And many states, Virginia particularly did this, offered pay in land certificates. So Virginia having an awful lot of land in the West, if you were, and they did it according to your rank, if you were private, you might get 100 acres. If you were a lieutenant, you might get 200 or 300. If you were a captain, you got 500. If you were a colonel, 1,000, whatever. So, but all of these pieces of paper are circulating all through the war and in the years immediately after the war. Let's go to the next one. Now, what happened with those certificates? Well, let But I wanted to say more about what I was talking about. Let's go back to the last one so we don't confuse things. Could you go back to the last one with all those angry people? All right, that's good. Now, all of these pieces of paper, as time went on, Farmer Brigerhoff got this piece of paper in August of 1777, and by November of 1783, with the war over, it's still just a piece of paper. So what can you do with it? In every state, we now have agents of large-scale merchants or big planters, people who had been involved in speculation in Western lands and so on, going around and saying, friend Brigerhoff, this piece of paper says you're entitled to 50 pounds. Doesn't look like they're ever going to give you 50 pounds. So why don't you give it to us and we'll pay you cash on the barrel head, 3 pounds. So maybe that's not too bad a bargain. I've got 3 pounds. And so all of these all of these things we might call the war debt were accumulating in the hands of wealthy land speculators, wealthy merchants, and to a considerable extent, investors overseas. So some of this is held now not by Americans, but by Europeans as well. Let's go to the next step. So this is about the limiting the money supply. And we're going to be dealing now with Pennsylvania as a good example of what is an issue here. And the driving forces are Alexander Hamilton and Robert Morris, who is often described as the financier of the revolution. The kind of economic depression that followed on the peace in 1783 and also was matched by an enormous amount of British merchants returning and flooding the former colonies with a lot of goods that they had depended on, that had been very difficult to obtain or very expensive. So many people, let's call them the business community, our large-scale planters, were very concerned that the states, and we're talking specifically now about Pennsylvania, were simply printing money, whether it had any backing or not, so that it would be quickly depreciating, but within the first few months of its being issued, it had to be accepted as payment for everything. So they were very concerned that this democratic legislature in which anybody could vote, so that the casual laborer in the city, or the man hiring himself out to help with the harvest in the country, would have an equal vote with substantial people like Robert Morris or George Clymer or any of the Thomas Willing, any of the wealthy people in Philadelphia, who were in fact the engines of the Pennsylvania economy. So they got together, and Robert Morris, particularly, who would be the head of it, got a charter from the Continental Congress for the Bank of North America, which was based in Philadelphia. It was rather quickly pointed out that the Continental Congress had no authority to charter a bank. So it was almost immediately rechartered by Pennsylvania in 1782, the very last, well, right after the war. All right. So what the Bank of North America had in its charter was the ability, and they wanted it to be a monopoly, to print paper money. So instead of the supply of money, of paper money, being controlled by a legislature that they considered to be a gang of ragamuffins and vagabonds and so on, they wanted that to be in the hands of the state. So the state refused to accept these promises to pay as payment for taxes. And consequently, most people paid their taxes with what were still legal tenure, the paper money issued by one or other of the states or by the Continental Congress. So this was to tighten up the money supply almost immediately, as soon as the bank had its claimed authority to be the sole issuer of paper money. So by 1785, the Pennsylvania legislature decided it was in the interest of the people of Pennsylvania to simply void the charter given in 1782 and shut down the Bank of North America altogether. It moved actually then to New York. Let's go on to the next one. Can we get to the next one? So that's the act of this very democratic legislature. Now, the legislature had, in Pennsylvania, really in every other state, they weren't stupid. They realized that if you brought a combination of continental bills and bills from Pennsylvania and North Carolina to pay your taxes, instead of having, as they had striven to do in the colonial period, instead of having enough brought in taxes to pay off and then withdraw the paper money, the state treasury would be left with a pile of paper. They wouldn't have any money at all. So they had then, the Pennsylvania legislature, significantly led by Philadelphia merchants who were elected, and but with the majority of this very democratic legislature, they decide taxes can be paid only in specie. And as I mentioned earlier, the speculators had been very busy amassing all the wartime debt certificates. And these were not acceptable for payment of taxes. So we go on to a crisis then. It begins to bubble up very quickly in the years immediately after the war. Can we go to the next one? And that is that many farmers are unable to pay their taxes because in the tremendous shortage of hard money that persisted, it's very difficult for a small farmer in rural Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania particularly, to come up with enough money to pay his taxes. So there's a great deal of opposition to the tax collectors, who were probably always unpopular, but here they were firmly standing against them. And a lot of this resistance is especially in the western counties, and it begins to pop up in 1784. And the western counties, I mean those counties that were west of the Susquehanna River, but it's equally true that there's some real resistance in the counties that were on the upper side, but eastern Susquehanna. So what would be Dauphin County, which is Harrisburg, and Northampton, which is Allentown, I think, if I'm confused, that they had a great deal of resistance to tax collection. And the reason they were objecting to the tax collection, which most of these folks couldn't pay, was because the state was then requiring the sheriff to either seize property from a farmer or from anybody, a shopkeeper, worth the amount of his taxes, or if he didn't have enough real property, or something, you know what I mean, he didn't have enough tangible property that could be just put in a wagon and taken away, or livestock to be led away, then they would foreclose on his farm. And in most cases, and this is true not just in Pennsylvania, this is true in all of the colonies, that objection to and resistance was fueled largely because when Farmer Brinkerhoff's farm is put up for auction because he couldn't pay his taxes, an agent of some big land speculator is there to make sure that the bidding doesn't go very high and that then it's sold for a song to a merchant or lawyer in Philadelphia or in Boston, wherever, whatever state it may be. And the resistance begins to focus on this. Well, I'm saying this in Pennsylvania, but it's also true in almost all the states where this was happening. And the western counties were almost entirely populated by Scotch-Irish people who had German people who had backed the revolution. They had served in the militia. They had given up all sorts of things during the war and not been paid for it. So there's a great deal of feeling against the merchants in Philadelphia, many of them pacifist Quakers, who are destroying the lives of so many people. Well, let's go on to the next one. I've got to get through some more stuff. All right. The painting there is actually of a battle in the Wyoming Valley, and this is around 44, Pennsylvania, where my wife's family lived. A combination of British loyalist regiments and Iroquois Indians came down from western New York and raided through there. So this had been it was in the very recent history. The people in the Wyoming Valley were from Connecticut. They were from Connecticut because Connecticut claimed, despite the royal charter to William Penn in 1682, that Connecticut extended west right through Pennsylvania. And before the war and immediately after, large numbers of Connecticut folks were acquiring land, but under title from Connecticut state and Connecticut counties that were set up in what Pennsylvania would claim was always part of Pennsylvania. And because they were unpaid, when orders were sent out by the state government to have militia units get rid of these Connecticut settlers, send them back to Connecticut, the militia, because they had never been paid for wartime service, refused to go. So you had a straight out rebellion by the militia. Let's go on to the next one now. Please. Yeah. Now, we're going to focus, that had been in 1784, 1786 in the state of Pennsylvania. Much better known than what was going on in Pennsylvania though it's always true in almost all of the states, is Shays' Rebellion, as it was termed. This came to a head in 1786 because instead of having angry farmers outside the courthouse when the sheriff was selling neighbor Ned's farm to some speculator for a song, the local people, led by, this is in the western part of Massachusetts, not in the older settlements, led by Captain Daniel Shays, or Shay, who had had a very honorable record during the war. They decided to simply walk into the courthouse and eject the judge or the sheriff and the speculators from Boston and send them home and say, we are not going to allow any sale of or any foreclosures of, and this continued through from the summer of 1786 through the fall and winter, and they reached a point where they felt they were sufficiently strong that roughly 1,000 of these, and they were all former militia or continental soldiers, 1,000 of these men attempted, led by Shay himself, attempted to seize the armory, the state armory in Springfield in western Massachusetts in January 1787. They were repulsed by a military force of militia from the eastern part of the state under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln. And as you may remember, this is often, Shays' Rebellion is often cited as one of the major influences on why we needed a constitution in 1787, that you were going to have this kind of anarchy everywhere. Let's go to the next one, Deb. I don't remember what's coming next. All right. Now, when the Constitution was drawn, it did a great deal. It, among many other things, it said that only the federal government would be allowed to coin money, and that banks could continue to issue paper money, but states could not. The states could not issue money. So you took away from what was still the very democratic Pennsylvania Assembly the right to have anything to do with money. So that's just one thread of the opposition. There's very widespread opposition to ratification, especially in all of those areas where we had a rural opposition to tax collectors and so on. And the Pennsylvania delegation tried to avoid having to ratify at all. The legislature tried to avoid ratification at all and held out as best they could. And there is a very, very strong opposition to the Constitution. Interestingly, because he's an old friend of mine, George Mason of Gunston Hall walked out and refused to sign the Constitution. And Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, took his arm, and they both walked out as anti-federalists because, among other things, Mason felt there was no Declaration of Rights, no Bill of Rights that had been a central part of the rights of Englishmen from 1689 on. So let's go to the next one. We're not going to talk about the Constitution. All right, now, under the Constitution, the federal government was able to create what was called the Bank of the United States. It's called the First Bank of the United States because in Jackson's time, its charter will be allowed to run out. Its federal charter, it was chartered for a short time, and it had run out. So there is now and this was essentially a private bank chartered by the nation, by the Congress. So this was one theme of Hamilton's drive. And in 1791, as now Secretary of the Treasury, on the grounds that in order to restore our credit overseas as well as nationally, all debts had to be paid, all debts owing to the Continental Congress of wartime, all had to be paid at face value. This is the Funding Act in 1791. And the reason, let's go to the next one. The reason that this was objectionable to many people across the country was that everybody knew that people like Robert Morris had truckloads, even vaults, full of paper claims on the Continental Congress that they had gotten for pennies, and that they decided, consequently, would have been worthless. But this led to objections in many places. He also placed, at the same time, an excise tax on a number of items. Again, it was like a lot of the British taxation before the war. The specific item wasn't really going to be terribly burdensome on very many people, but it was much more that it was in the light of the Funding Act, which had rewarded speculators who now were able to hold on to enormous amounts of money and continue in that way. The so-called Whiskey Rebellion, which was over the excise tax on whiskey, which many farmers, and this happens in Pennsylvania, the many farmers, especially in the West, not by any means limited to that, made various kinds of alcoholic beverages, some for use at home and some for sale, just as they would have done with their wheat crop. They want sunflower at home, but they mainly want to sell it. So they would have to pay an excise tax, and they objected strenuously to this in the light of this reward to speculators. Now, by 1794, Pennsylvania had a totally new constitution that had limited the democracy significantly. So these were angry people, many who could no longer vote and could no longer look to their legislatures. And that had also fueled Shays' Rebellion almost 10 years earlier, or 8 years earlier. And so the new constitution in Pennsylvania, by limiting the right to vote, essentially trimmed democracy. It was no longer a democracy. And almost all the states that had looked more to a quantity vote were now focused on a quality vote. So that property qualifications, where they had been reduced or eliminated in 76 or immediately thereafter, beginning around 1790, all came back, and in many ways were raised much higher than they had been. So it would be in the Jacksonian era, the era of Jacksonian democracy, as Arthur Schlesinger termed it, that we would begin to get rid of these often very onerous property qualifications and limitations on any kind of democracy. There's also another kind of limitation that will run through from about the same period in the 1790s and continue right up to our present day of limiting votes by people who had immigrated to this country. So there are efforts, none of them quite successful, but efforts to succeed in making immigrants have to wait 21 years before they could register to vote. And there is also, in the closing years of the 18th century, there is a further uprising when, once again, democracy is curtailed in many ways. And many of the ways in which it's curtailed are the ways that it's being curtailed in the 21st century. That once again, there is this drive to have a quality rather than a quantity election. So I've talked enough. Let's get some discussion. I should have given you more time. I'm sorry. I ran a little over.
Okay, we're up for any comments or questions. Or online.
Hi, thank you very much for that very informative lecture. Could you say a few words about the role John Marshall played in all of this? As a private lawyer, he defended many of the merchants and farmers' right to pay their English debts in currency, but he also represented English businessmen who demanded a species payment of the debts. But then as a Supreme Court justice, he had to resolve this conflict.
Oh, yes. Yes, very, very good. Thank you for bringing that up. John Marshall is going to be a major figure in developing the whole American legal tradition. And at this point, he is a young lawyer who is defending people in, as you mentioned. So I'm not going to say any more.
Other comments and questions? So you focus particularly on democracy in terms of the vote, but there are many other ways of defining democracy and other issues that constitute democracy, institutions and laws. So overall, how democratic was the early United States? How democratic were the individual states by comparison?
Oh, we have by 1800 the election of Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson is ironically, because he's a very large landowner and a slave owner, is a strong voice for democracy. And if you remember, as Henry Adams, the United States, in the administration of Jefferson and Madison, begins with the idea that he has a long, wonderful chapter on this, is that that particular 1800 election saw the Federalists, the Constitution Party, feeling and insisting that what Jefferson intended was an absolute bloodbath of the upper classes, the people who were the economic drivers of the country, and the destruction of religion, because he was committed to some kind of democracy. But we have to remember that all through that period, democracy was not a particularly positive word. The people who thought that the 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution was not just bad, but it was totally destructive of civilization to have democracy. And so that was a real struggle. And then the Jeffersonian Party continued to push for wide suffrage and somewhat limited government. So, yeah. I don't know if I answered that.
Oh, it's a big question. But, certainly it was fascinating to hear the monetary issues and how they affected democracy. Other comments or questions? Mohini, do we have any comments or questions online? Okay. So
let me throw in.
Thanks, Richard, for presenting today.
Can I throw in one more comment?
Sure.
All right. The two are tied very closely together, and I think they still are. That if you want to say that we need to make the world safe for billionaires, you are going to want to curtail the vote of poor people, people who may be on welfare, people who are just barely getting by. And so the economic and the political are very, very closely related. And if we want to have a democracy, we have to have some kind of security for even the casual laborer. So anyway, that's just my last word. Thanks.
Great. Well, let's thank Richard for another great presentation, and he'll be back next week.
Yes. So thank you all.